Okay, so welcome back to this is episode 2 of Economy Rise. I'm Hardish.
I'm Aaron.
So Aaron, the first episode you made an interesting reference to a quote, right? This quote by Simon Kuznets, who actually won the Economics Nobel Prize in 1971. And he had this quote that is a lot of people refer to in the economics world about there are four types of countries or four types of economies, right? There's a developed, underdeveloped, Argentina and Japan,
Right.
right? And I mean, the context of the quote is that obviously you have developed economies, emerging economies, but also you have outliers.
Right.
And when you take these two countries, for example, you can see Argentina as sort of the fall from grace. They were doing very well up till I think the end of the 19th century, and actually as far as 1960s, they were among the top 10 economies.
Right.
And now they are, a lot of people think it's a failed state.
Right.
And on the other hand, you have a country like Japan, which was for a very long time, struggling, and then they had a lot of military might,
Right.
right? And then they were brought down to their knees, and then very soon after they became a powerhouse again, right?
Right.
And that was the classic Rex to riches story, right? So we're going to use this frame to talk about slightly related still to the first episode, where we talk about foreign exchange and also like inflation and interest rates. But we're going to look at, I think, four very interesting scenarios where interest rates, how interest rates plays in different economies, right?
Correct.
But anything you want to add on to the context of that quote?
There's a reason why he said that quote. It's because obviously developed and underdeveloped economies have different profiles.
Yeah.
But Japan had every reason to fail from an economic perspective, right? It didn't have good flat plains for agriculture. It didn't have commodities for mining and export, right? It didn't have a young and growing population, but it succeeded despite that. Argentina has the reverse. It had every reason to succeed as an economy, but it failed due to political reasons.
Yeah.
So today we're not going to be going into the quote, but it's a very good metaphor for the different interest rate policies of how different economies approach inflation, right?
Yeah.
Over the recent past. And we're going to be replacing developed with the US and underdeveloped with Malaysia, right? To explain.
Well, we can say emerging, just
Yeah,
so that
okay.
we don't upset some people.
Yeah, sure, right? I mean, it's just technical terms, right?
Right.
So it'll be we'll be exploring the different interest rate policies of the US, Malaysia, Japan, Argentina, about how they tackle the recent inflation scare.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think, but before we try and tackle a topic like this, is worth maybe doing a little bit of primer in terms of this concept of inflation, right? With regards to how interest rates refers to inflation, and the reason I want to do that is because I think all of us are aware of these terms, right? I think conceptually we understand what inflation is. In practice, we understand what interest rates is because most of us either have fixed deposit rates, right, or we go to the bank and get a loan. So obviously, interest plays a role there as well. But I think sometimes what a lot of people don't fully appreciate is the relationship between the two. To me, the way I think about it is that if you think of inflation, it's you can think of it as a monster, right? This monster that sort of eats the value of your money, right? For the same amount of money, you basically get less of it, right?
Yes.
Which is a phenomenon in economics anyway, right? This is the natural direction of value over time, right? But where interest rate comes in is that it is one of the main tools that central banks use to regulate inflation,
Right.
right? So the idea is that from a central bank's perspective, you really are trying to manage price stability and also the making sure there's employment, right?
Right.
And inflation sort of affects both of that. And the way to control that, the one of the levers you have, among many different ways, but one of the primary levers you have is to manage your interest rates, right? So with that context, then I think you now come back to this quote where you have, okay, what does a developed economy do with their interest rates? What does a emerging or underdeveloped with respect to a developed economy, right, do with interest rates? But then you also have two very divergent policies in Japan and Argentina, which is very interesting cases that we will also try to go through as well, right?
Yes.
So let's start with US, for example, right? So US, it is a stated objective to try and maintain inflation at 2%. But then the context to this is that for the past, since 2009, interest rates have been about 0%, 0.25, right? So we assume it to be zero.
Yes.
Let's start first with understanding the relationship without going into too technical, but I think it's still good for the listeners, right? The relationship between inflation and interest rates, because there's also the real interest rates and the nominal interest rates, right?
Yes.
So maybe if I could ask you to give us a 101, or how do you explain this to a 5-year-old kid?
I'm sure all of us are familiar with the concept of how inflation erodes the value of our money, right? You can basically say that for a given dollar, if your inflation is 2%, right, then your dollar is worth 2% less.
Yeah.
So interest rates are, they're very analogous to the typical definition of interest rates from a bond perspective or a fixed deposit perspective. If your interest rate is 4% at the central bank, then you have inflation of 2%, you basically have a real interest rate of 2%, right?
The difference between two, right?
Right. So the real interest rate, as the name suggests, is the real value of the interest rate that the Federal Reserve set. And in order to combat inflation, you typically hike the interest rate. Because let's say, think about what inflation means, right? It means higher prices. Higher prices result from higher demand in the economy. So if the central bank raises interest rates, it makes it more expensive to borrow loans, and it feeds into makes the rest of the economy more expensive, and that reduces demand, and therefore that should reduce inflation.
So now we come into we start going into this sort of environment we are in right now. So that is the starting point, right? But we are, I believe, very far from the starting point right now in this particular economic environment.
Yes.
And so the first anomaly, if I can use that word, is that the interest rates in US now is 5.5%.
Yes.
Right, which is like 5.5% more than what it used to be, right? Yes. Because it's been practically zero for a very long time, right? So what has forced the US economy or the Federal Reserve to take this step, which has created a lot of problems for everyone else, right? Because it's so far above normal, right? And the fact that it's being done by the US economy, which affects the entire global world, right?
Yes.
There has to be some real reasons for them to do it, but also how much do they care about the impact it has to everyone else, right? So to begin with, like what drove them to do this in the first place?
Right. So actually, it's worth mentioning that the interest rate hikes themselves are a consequence of a bigger problem, which was that they printed a lot of money during the pandemic. Right? And the US was uniquely situated to be able to do this because they were the reserve currency of the world. They had the wherewithal to print a lot of money during the pandemic where emerging economies like Malaysia may not, right?
You're talking about these are they gave out basically cash handouts, right, to families and businesses and all that.
Correct. So they did helicopter money, which is basically taboo in the economic world, where they send $2,000 checks, if I'm not wrong, directly to households, like in mail. But the much larger portion of this printed money, right, as we like to refer it to, is actually in the form of food vouchers, or they call them the SNAP program, right, where basically low-income families receive food vouchers that they can trade for food items at grocery stores. And you can see a very direct correlation very visibly direct correlation in the stock prices of such retail companies, right? So that, for context, the SNAP program ended in February 2023 or March 2023. You can see a lot of retail like Walmart, Dollar General, their stock prices fell. So it's very visible evidence, right? And at the end of the day, it represents printed money. So that, back to our logic earlier, right? It increases higher demand, which means higher prices, right? Businesses will try and profit from it. And that sets the context for the pre-October 2022 or pre-interest rate high environment. households were flush with cash, and by extension, businesses. And so the Federal Reserve saw that the economy, right, households and businesses were able to absorb the impact of high interest rates.
Right.
Relative to, let's say, Malaysia, where we did not have this extended amount of printed money.
Right.
And so that informed probably why the Federal Reserve saw fit to raise interest rates so high where other countries could not. Right. So that was the optimal way for them to raise the interest to combat inflation, because U.S. households and U.S. Businesses had large cash balances to basically absorb the hit from high interest rates, right? Relative to, let's say, Malaysia, where we did not have that large cash balances to absorb a Malaysian central bank raising interest rates in the same manner.
But they were in a way responding to a high inflation, which was in a way self-inflicted because of this cash that was printed, right? Correct. So there was a lot of demand. The second scenario is, of course, underdeveloped economy, right, which is Malaysia. But somewhat linked to this is that when you raise the interest rates, on the one hand, okay, you do it because you want to help regulate inflation. But at the same time, wouldn't there be concerns about, for example, hurting your own economy in terms of, like, people have loans, so the loans become more expensive, right? How come they have so much flexibility to do something like this?
Yeah, right. So you raise a very good question. And this is something that is very, very familiar to us, because if you remember when our central bank raised interest rates, our mortgages all went up, right? We felt the 100, 200 ringgit increase in mortgage payments. In the US, they have a very unique setup. US mortgages, for whatever reason, are mainly fixed rate in nature. So rather than moving immediately with the central bank rates, they have a lag, call it 3 years on average. So the average US homeowner did not feel the step up in mortgage payments when the Federal Reserve raised interest rates until, let's say, 2 to 3 years later, right? As opposed to us who felt it immediately, right? And this actually gave the US households a lot of extra capacity to withstand the Federal Reserve's interest rate hikes, because, right, you had a 2 or 3 year preparation time before it hit you.
So a real smart American would have used that surplus cash to pay off as much of their mortgage at a lower price.
Okay, I haven't really thought about the distribution of possibilities, but you could say that,
Yeah, okay. But are they quite unique in terms of having this fixed rate?
Yes, yeah. So I think if you do a search on AI or something, right, you will find that very few countries actually standardize fixed rate mortgages, right, as a widespread nationwide concern. Of course, you could walk into a Malaysian bank and ask for a fixed rate mortgage today, but you will find that the mortgage payments are much steeper than a variable rate mortgage. Right. So US is quite unique in that everyone gets a fixed rate mortgage by default, right? And variable rate mortgages are the outlier. Yeah.
Okay. So meaning in essence, they could do this without hurting their own people, to a certain
Basically,
extent.
yes.
Right. Okay. Damn if they hurt everyone else.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's true.
All right. Okay. Okay, so that brings us now to everyone else. The first case is, let's use Malaysia as a proxy for the underdeveloped economies or emerging economies. So you mentioned, like, in America, partly they printed a lot of money, right? Now Malaysia also did do some cash handout during the pandemic. I tried to look up the numbers. So in terms of from a US point of view, right, it was 1.8 trillion in terms of transfers. So there was a 5 trillion disbursement, but to households, it was about 1.8 trillion, give and take, right? And in Malaysia, as far as I know, I tried to look up a Bank Negara archive. I think it was about 16 billion. So if you sort of do it on a per capita basis, right, every American got about 6K, every Malaysian got about 500 ringgit.
Okay.
Right? So does that fit with the idea that, in Malaysia's case, for example, there was a limit to how much the government could print to help individuals because of a concern of inflation. Right?
Yeah, it's true. So as a general matter, you don't want to print money. Basically, you just want to avoid inflation, right? So especially for underdeveloped or emerging economies like Malaysia, and when I say Malaysia, I include others like Indonesia, Thailand, right? Anyone who's in emerging economy is the same. They generally try to avoid printing too much money the way the US did, because it causes rampant inflation. And so something like the Malaysian Central Bank will try to avoid printing money as a way to combat fundamental problems with the economy. Right? The traditional way that you approach stimulus or Keynesian policy is to use government debt.
Right.
And because in a recession, household and businesses tend not to have the capacity for further investment to stimulate, whereas the government does, right? It can borrow debt to get the cash, right? From the central bank or whatever, right? But it's debt in nature rather than printed money in nature.
Right.
So it doesn't cause inflation. There's an offset in credit there.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So, but the context is whatever it is. I mean, for a variety of reasons, we also had high inflation, right? I think it went up to about 4.7%. And of course, people were feeling the pinch.
Yes.
Now, based on this logic, obviously, the Malaysian government or any emerging economy would not have as much capacity to, number one, raise interest rates, and for some reasons that we covered in the previous episode, right? But also, neither can you give out too much cash, right? For the same reason, because you're actually going to drive up inflation again, right?
Yes.
So it feels like we're kind of between a rock and a hard place, like in terms of the policy prescriptions that you have, and it's mainly caused by. So the government always says is some of these are caused by factors external, right? And it seems like it's a fair comment to make. But is there any comment in terms of how Malaysia approached this, right? I mean, did we do as much as we could given all the constraints? Or do you think in your mind, for an emerging economy in such a situation, right, could there have been other prescriptions as well?
Yeah, sure. So Malaysia actually, or rather all emerging economies, right, they could not do what the US did, which was print tons of money because that would cause very rampant inflation. So we actually did the more traditional approach by where the government took on debt, right? And basically, use that as stimulus. If you all remember, there was the EPF withdrawals.
Yeah.
But what the EPF withdrawals was basically a substitute for government debt for the middle class, right? Because the middle income people tend to be substantially richer, wealthier than the lower income group. Despite,
and they probably have significantly more in their EPF savings.
Yes, right. So they have a lot more EPF, and therefore they could replace government debt as a form of stimulus. But also the government, we have to give them credit for being a bit creative in how they approach stimulus, where they did not have the luxury of printing money, rampantly. So, for instance, you may all have remembered the egg price situation, right?
Yeah.
So where we halted egg imports to Singapore. That's a form of price control.
Yeah.
Because you're artificially tamping down demand. And usually these price controls are generally unfavorable to economies because you're interfering with free market forces.
Yeah.
And that has consequences, right? Which it did, right? But that was one way the Malaysian government saw the trade-off was necessary to make. And that helped to combat inflation. And also the recent the Madani rice scheme, right? So basically what that does is that it more equitably redistributes rice subsidies. Probably don't want to get too deep into the weeds for that, right? But that's also a creative form of how to combat inflation, right? Or at least one of the policy goals. So we can see that under the Malaysian policymakers of underdeveloped countries, right? Had to take a more traditional approach relative to literally just blasting a ton of money into the economy, which is, like I said earlier, was taboo.
Right.
Yeah.
Talking about inflation, right? Just I don't know whether you remember this because of age difference, right?
Okay.
But in the 90s, 95 at least, the Malaysian government had a policy of achieving or trying to achieve zero inflation. There was this campaign, Inflasi Sifa. Does it ring a bell?
No.
At all? Right. Yeah, if you look it up, right, it's quite interesting. Okay. But when I tried to read about it, I'm not sure what they were aiming for. I think they were they were not saying that they wanted inflation at zero. They wanted to maintain inflation, i.e. it doesn't rise year by year, right? So meaning you aim for the zero growth of inflation. But I looked up some really interesting articles from the time, and there was one by I think Wong Chun Wai, who is right now he's the Bernama chairman. He used to be the CEO of the Star, right? And I found an old blog piece of his, which we probably link into in the show notes, where he makes reference to, at that time, Tun Mahathir was the Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim was the Deputy Prime Minister, and they both are literally somewhat reminding Malaysians to temper down their spending because we have tasted too much of foreign branded goods.
Okay.
So this was in the 90s where, you had a lot of brands suddenly coming in. You had, for example, Lot 10, which was, I think, the first designer mall in the city. They came in around the 90s.
Right.
So there was this argument that we are spending too much on foreign goods, right? And that is driving up inflation. So it was quite interesting. And at that point, I think inflation was about 3% plus, right? But the growth was about 8%, right? We were doing 8% growth and stuff like that. So yeah, I just found that quite interesting that the government was actually aiming for zero inflation. I just thought I'd throw it in there. It's interesting because the context for that is that it was an environment where the government was trying to get people to spend less.
On foreign goods or domestic
foreign
goods?
Yeah,
okay.
Foreign goods.
Yeah, but I think it's also worth pointing out that at the time it was a higher growth economy for Malaysia. And you would expect both higher growth and higher inflation in that scenario. Yeah. So a good example might be, I don't know, Indonesia now, right? Yeah, that might be related.
Right, okay. Yeah. So let's move to now one of the two outliers, right? So let's look at Japan, for example. Japan, which was, first of all, is interesting because for quite a long time, for the 17 years, it was at 0% interest rate. I think up till 2015, their interest rate was zero.
Right.
And then they went to negative territory. It was negative 0.1 interest rate.
There's actually a very interesting phrase called NIRP, negative interest rate policy.
Okay, NIRP.
NIRP.
Okay. So first of all, I think all of us conceptually, we understand that when you put money in a bank, if you just say your interest rate is like, say, 2%, right? So you're getting 2% returns annually, right? You're earning that interest. What probably might not be so obvious conceptually is that what happens when the interest rate is negative? The thing, it seems like you'll be paying the bank to keep your money.
Yes.
Right? So what drove Japan to actually take this step? And had it ever been done before? Was it really seen as an unorthodox move? So maybe you can give us some context to why that even happened in the first place.
Okay, so to keep things not too complicated, the negative interest rate policy was basically just a regular reduction of interest rates from Japan's already zero, right? So you think about what the US did and if they had to go further.
Right.
That's Japan, right? So that actually happened. But it's actually a greater symptom of Japan's lost decades. So I'm sure most of you know that Japan crashed and burned in 1989 and never recovered.
Yeah.
And when the economy crashes like that, economies have a term for it called animal spirits, right? Which represents things that cannot be captured by data, but matter nonetheless. So think about something like consumer sentiment. It's not tangible, right? But it matters for economic health. And so as a matter of economic theory, when your economy crashes so hard, right, it enters a similar situation as 1929 American Great Depression, where everyone just loses confidence in the economy. And it creates this downward flywheel effect, right? Downward spiral, where consumers have not enough to spend, so that it hits businesses' revenue, and they have to fire employees, which then reduces consumer spending, and it just goes down further and further, right? It's like the opposite concept of inflation, which is deflation.
Right.
And so when deflation sinks into the economy, it's very hard to reverse it. And so in 2015 or around there, when the NIRP policy started, that was when the then Japanese Prime Minister, the one who got assassinated, what's his name? Shinzo Abe, right?
Yeah.
He introduced
Abenomics.
Yes, correct. Abenomics. So there was the 3 L's of Abenomics, one of which was a very aggressive interest rate policy to re-stimulate the Japanese economy. And it's really a hallmark of how badly the Japanese economy was in, the shape it was in.
When you say aggressive interest rate policy, it's like this is what is pushing it.
Yeah, it's like negative,
right?
And to be fair, I think at the time, even a lot of Western developed economies were considering it. But that's a whole can of worms for itself. Let's not go into that, right? As with respect to Japan, it was really that the economy was so sluggish that they had to entertain it because they were already at zero. And without getting too deep into the weeds, right, you are bringing it into the realm of modern monetary theory, MMT, right?
So again, conceptually, is it when you do negative interest rates, is it because you are essentially trying to send a signal to people that you should not save money, you should spend it?
Yes, because basically, think about what
because
it means.
It costs you more to save money, right?
Yeah, like when you deposit your money in the bank, you have to pay interest rate to the bank. That's what negative interest rate means. And vice versa, when the bank loans you money, they need to pay interest rate. Right. So it in theory stimulates spending, but in practice it actually doesn't. But let's not get too.
Okay. So the headlines, I think, sometime last week was that for the first time in 17 years, they raised interest rates to between 0 and 0.1%. Right? But it was enough of a headlines because it's no longer negative. Right? It's actually 0 to 0.1. So why this change, first of all?
Okay, so the reason is because, as you all know, Japan recently depreciated its currency by 50%, right? I think it's 47% at last count. It's definitely going to be 50% by end of the year. And basically, they had a twofold reason for it, right? So one was that the whole world was going through global inflation, like very high inflation, and Japan wanted to take advantage of that environment to basically stimulate inflation in the economy in a deliberate manner. So they actually went in the opposite direction by, I'm not sure if they lowered interest rates, but they definitely devalued the currency. And that helps exporters, right? So Japan exports a lot. So basically what that did was it did the opposite of what US and Malaysia did, which was to hike interest rates.
Yeah.
And that was aimed at creating inflation. When it creates inflation, it creates the conditions for what we described earlier, which is when you see the value of your money eroding based on time, you are more inclined to spend it.
Yeah.
Right? Businesses are more inclined to invest. That was what they were going to. But there was another big reason why they devalued the currency so heavily. It's the same effect as lowering interest rates, which was that at the time there was a lot of capital de-risking out of China, and they were trying to attract money flows from China, right? Basically capture it back to Japan. So it was a very opportunistic situation for them to devalue the currency. So that sets the context for your question. Why did they, recently decide to raise the interest rates?
Okay.
Basically, they achieved the inflation goal, right?
Okay.
And the opposite, now they have to face the opposite problem, which is that they have too much debt, right? I think they're paying 100% of their tax revenue on interest payments alone.
Right.
It just tells you how unhealthy the Japanese economy is. And when you have high inflation, right, the policy prescription is to raise your interest rates. So if you have too much debt and you can't pay the interest on the debt, you can't get interest rates too high. So there's a ceiling to how high interest rates can go.
Okay.
Right. And as a result, they need to really balance the risks of deflation, inflation very carefully.
Okay.
Right. That was why they chose to raise interest rates above zero.
Okay.
Basically in anticipation of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, so we come to Argentina. So then you mentioned, there's a ceiling to how high interest rate can go. I think Argentina is certainly testing how high that ceiling is, right?
Actually, it's quite interesting because Argentina also has that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But the problem is that they really blasted through into space, beyond that.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to set it up, is so the situation in Argentina is that I think sometime last year, interest rate went as high as 120%. Right. And I think we touched on this in the earlier episode as well.
Yes.
There's always let's call them armchair economists.
Okay. Right.
Who the argument is that, well, we should raise interest rates to be competitive.
Right.
Well, Argentina's interest rates is 120%, and it's obviously they're not. I mean, I'm not rushing to put my money there. I'm sure a lot of people are not as well, right?
Yes.
So I mean, it doesn't. It's not as easy as that, right? So coming back to this, the frame of this particular episode. This is a country that's gone in the totally opposite direction, right? So where they are going super positive, if you want to, as opposed to negative like Japan.
Right.
120+% interest rates. Inflation, I think, is about 80%. It's still
80%.
Yeah, it's still way out there, in terms of what you expect in a normal scenario, right? With everything that we know about how this whole argument in terms of Argentina being a classic example of a fall from grace, right? Where they used to be moving in the same direction. Inflation is high, interest rates is high,
right.
But obviously, if the argument is that makes them attractive, it doesn't, lah, right?
Yeah. So if Malaysian audiences remember about a year or two ago, there was this headlines going around that Malaysia was becoming a failed state. So that's actually not true. But if you really want to see what a failed state looks like, look at Argentina, right? Their economy has completely collapsed and they have no ability to take care of themselves. So basically think about what if Japan went beyond the pale. That's Argentina. That's what Japan will look like, okay? And they're trying to avoid that. Argentina is already there. And, the reasons are actually political, but let's not get into that now. We want to talk about the monetary policy as well as interest rate policy. So that's the context, right? If you're already a failed state, then technically you have no ability to take care of yourself. Who can you rely on to take care of you? It will be foreign investors. It will be foreigners buying your stuff. And, it's basically exports, right? So when the US hiked their interest rates very high, Argentina, by virtue of its currency being completely worthless, they rely on US dollar a lot. So they basically had to follow the interest rate policy of the US. Right? And think about what you would do as a foreign investor if you had pesos in Argentina and the US raised the interest rate. You would sell your pesos and go invest in dollars, right? So given how reliant Argentina is on foreign investors, they needed to keep the money in the country. And so they did a twofold approach to it, right? One was obviously they raised interest rates very high because then it gives the foreign investors the same, right? The same interest rate as the US to park your money in Argentina. And also because they were so reliant on exports, they devalued the peso greatly, right? So normally when you devalue your peso, it hurts your foreign investors, just like our ringgit is being devalued. And so the increased interest rate was supposed to offset that, right? Because imagine if you invested your ringgit into peso, Argentinian peso, and they devalued the currency, so it reduces the value of your peso, but then they raise the interest rates to offset that. So you can see, right? It's an offsetting thing. And the whole point of this is to placate the foreign investors, right? So who suffers? It came at the expense of the Argentinian economy. Basically, when you are a failed state, you have no luxury of prioritizing yourself. You have to prioritize outsiders, right? And that explains why, Argentina was an outlier in their interest rate policy. It was very much placating towards the foreign economy rather than domestic economy. On top of that, they had a very contentious election, which the incumbent government lost, right? As we all know, Milei won and came in with his, new approach. So that really explains why Argentina was such an outlier in its interest rate policy, right? In the way it approached tackling of inflation. No other country basically did that, right? And it goes back to our quote, right? How there are 4 different types of countries. you have developed, you have underdeveloped, you have Japan, you have Argentina.
Okay. So just to wrap it up, with that quote in mind. So it sounds like in an ideal situation, if you're not America, right, where you don't have the practically the license to do as you please at the expense of everyone else. You have to work with what you have. But out of this, it sounds like between the two outliers, Japan is doing okay and Argentina is, we really have no idea how it is going to turn out. Okay, so all right, so I think we've covered that. Thank you very much to Simon Kuznets for this quote that allowed us to turn an entire episode, turn it into an entire episode. So this has been Economy Rise. I'm Hardish and
I'm Aaron,
and we'll see you at the next episode.
And if you have any questions, please feel free to link in our comments.